Well, hello everyone. My name's Mr. Scott. We're going to go ahead and get started. Um, so I work with Embrace Tutoring along with Mr. Anthony, and my specialty is mostly in the English portions of the test. So anything having to do with reading composition, anything having to do with writing and language, if you have no idea what a semicolon should do, or you have no idea how to connect a graph to the main idea, I'm your guy. And I want to help today by going over some writing and language strategies. Before we get started, if you have any questions along the way, please do not hesitate to use the chat feature here on Zoom, and we will try and get to any questions that come up along the way. If I describe anything that you have no idea what I'm talking about, if I start going into an idea that you've never heard what I'm talking about before, that's a-okay. That's why we're here. So either bring it up in the chat as you're going along with us, or just write it down and make sure we have access to that later, because we want to make sure we're teaching you guys the stuff that you actually need to learn and not just rehashing stuff that y'all know already. So with that, let's dive into a little bit of writing and language. I know that Mr. Anthony already has gone over some math strategies with you, and he's already gone over some of those reading comp sections with you as well, like those sections where you have to read a passage and interpret the main idea and extrapolate evidence, like pull out evidence, find the definitions of certain words. What we're going to talk about is a totally different section of the test, and it's called the writing and language section. If you look in the chat, I've posted a link for the test that we're going to be looking at tonight. So if you haven't downloaded that PDF yet, go ahead and download SAT Practice Test 6, and it'll be on page 23 of the PDF. If you have one of these giant blue books, you'll also find the test in here. We'll be starting it on page 838 if you have the giant books, but 23 on the PDF. So if you joined Mr. Anthony for some of those reading strategies, you'll know it's very layered. Hopefully you've familiarized yourself with some of those steps already, and hopefully you know by now that you need to be reading the blurb and forming your own answers. If not, don't worry about it. We'll go over it again. The writing and language section is a lot more simple. Whereas reading comp, we usually take about 2 to 3 slides explaining proper strategies. Writing and language only takes up 1, and I'm going to show it to you as soon as I can share my screen here. 1 slide. That is just about everything you need to know about writing and language. The writing and language passages, as I said before, are not as concerned with you following a story. They're not as concerned with you following a main idea. They're more concerned with whether or not you know the rules by which writing operates. Do you know how a comma works? Do you know how a period is supposed to work? And can you point it out when it's being used incorrectly? Now, I know that a lot of times we get really nervous about grammar, right? Because grammar just seems like this huge invisible rule book that, who knows what's in there and who knows what those secret rules are. And you think the SAT is going to test you on like the most obscure grammar rule that no one's ever heard of in 400 years. The great news is that's not the case. The SAT is not going to pull from a very broad pool of grammar. What the SAT is more interested in the writing and language section, is whether you know a few rules really, really well. So in other words, you might not have to know about the most obscure use of who versus whom and whether or not to split an infinitive, but you're going to have to know commas, and you're going to have to really, really, really know commas. And that's why we want to know which of these strategies are the most concerning for you guys. If I'm going through these questions, which we'll be doing in a minute, if I'm going through these questions and you're like, I had no idea that those were the rules for a semicolon, or that those were the rules for a comma or a period, absolutely shoot a hand up in the chat or let us know, because we want to make sure that you know that you know that you know. Writing in language is unique in at least one other way, and that's that it's the only test that has more questions than minutes. That means you need to know these rules so well to the point that you're spending an average of less than a minute per question. Now, I guarantee you, you're going to step into this and feel almost insulted by how easy some of these questions are. Some of these questions are going to be super straightforward, and you'll be like, I don't know why I'm even being tested on this. But some of them, they're going to cause you to pause. They're going to cause you to sort of do a double take. And that double take, if you're not careful, will add up, and it will cost you on what's unfortunately a timed test. So I want to go over the strategies tonight, and then maybe later we'll be going over specific rules, deep dives, if you will, on specific grammar rules. All I'm really doing tonight is going over general strategies, and we'll be working through a writing and language section together. So here are the general strategies that Embrace endorses for the writing and language portion of the SAT. So again, it's fairly straightforward. What you need to do is start these from the beginning. When you come onto a passage in the writing and language section, don't like try to fiddle around, don't try to sandwich it or read a blurb. Usually there's not one. Usually all you get is a title for the writing and language section, and they just drop you in. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But this portion of the test is simple enough that you can really just start from the beginning and answer the questions as you go. Now, eventually, as you know, you will be running into like these big block numbers in the middle of the text, right? You'll be running into these questions. And when you do that, the temptation is going to be to try and figure out why that number is there just by staring at that number and just by staring at the words that are right next to it. I'm telling you, that's going to be a waste of your time. What you need to do to save yourself some time is, rather than try and figure out why that number 3 is there, right? Like, oh, what are they testing me on? Is this word misspelled? Is there a period there where there shouldn't be? Are the words reversed? Rather than breaking your skull over that, what you need to do is look at the question that that number links to. And then step number 2, written on this slide, skim the answer choices. And those answer choices are going to help you categorize what you're actually being tested on. What is the type of question? So you may have a question that is asking you about subject-verb agreement, right? Like, should I be saying he went to the store or he go to the store? Which one is grammatically correct? You'll be asked questions about tone. Tone is a little tricky to figure out sometimes, but tone is basically how a passage feels. And what you want to make sure is that no words are being used that really don't fit with the tone of the rest of the passage. Hopefully we'll find some examples and you'll see what I mean as we go. You'll also be looking at details of the passage, and you'll be looking at organization. Some questions will be asking you to actually move sentences around in the paragraph that better help with the flow of the overall section. So that's a lot at once. You're not going to have to hold that all in your head right on every question. But once you categorize what you're being tested on, then you can quickly see which one is right. Then you can quickly develop your own answer. Some of these like I said, are going to be common sense. If you're a speaker of English as your first language, or even as your second or third language, some of these tools are going to come very naturally. You might not know the name for the rule, but you know it sounds right. So you're going to develop your own answer. And then what you're going to do is take that answer that you have already in your head and you take it back to the multiple choices and find which one fits in your particular section. And that's it. Some general test taking strategy you should know is that sometimes you're going to be asked to choose not between bad questions and good answers, not between bad answers and good answers, but you'll be asked to choose between good answers and the best answer. So I want to give you two basic categories for writing and language questions, which we'll encounter tonight. And if you're, oh, that's just my picture there. If you're taking notes, you can go ahead and write these down. These are going to be the two major types of questions that you'll encounter. So on the writing and language section, one type of question you'll come up against, and these are the broadest categories. One type of question are proofreader questions. Proofreader. And these are your questions that have a clear right and wrong. This is where there might just be a word out of place or in the wrong tense, or punctuation used in the wrong way. Those are the clearest ones to answer, and those are the ones that you should just be able to solve like that. Like in less than a minute, you've got it. The trickier ones are going to be what I like to call editor questions. The editor questions are the questions where it's kind of like if a friend came up to you before class and they said, hey, I know how to write. I know like all the grammar rules and I know my spelling's correct. Like I have my parents check it, but for some reason it still sounds weird. Does this sound weird to you? And so those are those more what I would call sort of squishy questions. They're not like hard right and wrong. They're going to be asking you, does this sentence sound out of place? Does this word sound like quite the right word? Or do we need to choose something that's just a little bit better? So the proofreader and the editor questions are going to be the two types. Proofreader, again, that's where you get your subject and your verb agreement. That's where you get your commas, really just all punctuation. The editor questions have much more to do with tone. How a passage feels is what tone is. How a passage feels, and flow. How one sentence of the passage moves into the next one most naturally. A note on tone here, the SAT passages are all going to be what's called a medium formal tone. So the formal implies that these words are they're not going to sound like everyday speech. They're not going to sound like slang. They are going to be a little fancier. The issue that I think a lot of us fall into is we'll always choose the smartest sounding word. But actually, these tones are going to be more mid-level fancy. What I would say is that if you're thinking of these passages as wearing clothes, they're not all going to be in a three-piece suit, but they're all going to at least have their shirts tucked in. Okay, so they're not going to be the most high formal. They still want the general high school reading audience to be able to read this, but it is going to be higher level than if I were just texting my friend. It's that medium formal tone that you're going to watch for matches for. So what I'm going to do right now is pull up the practice test 6. Again, that's page 23 on your PDF or page 838 in the big blue book. And we're just going to work through a writing and language passage together. Hopefully, you'll see my process. You'll see how I use the strategies we talk about when I'm working through a writing and language passage. So I'll pull up that test right here. Okay, so this is what it should look like. You should have a title that says a necessary resource for science, and it should start on the winter of 1968. If you zoom out, this is what the whole page will look like. This is a little closer to what it's going to look like on test day. You'll have a title like this, your time expectation, and how many questions you're going to run into. All right, so let's dive in. And again, if anything comes up that you want to go over later, write it down so that we know we can go over it later, or just message it in the chat so I can go into it now. So as you can see here, we're usually given a blurb, right? In the reading comp sections, we're usually given a summary of what the passage is about, whether or not it's been written as fiction or as hard science. Here, we just get a title. Now that title gives you a basic idea of the passage's main idea, and that will be important, but really this is all you need to know. A necessary resource for science. So I know we're probably going to be talking about hard science, like biology or chemistry. And I know we're probably going to be talking about its relationship to natural resources. All right, so let's dive in. Remember our steps. We start at the beginning, and we don't stop until we run into one of these boxes, okay? So in the winter of 1968, scientists David Schindler and Greg Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into Lake 227, this is one of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area. Okay, so we've run into our first question. 227, space, this is one. Important to note, this section is all that we're allowed to consider changing. If we think that something up here was worded really weirdly, or if we think that something down here could be said better, if we didn't like the word contaminating, that's kind of tough. We're really only allowed to change everything that's underlined in question 1. Okay, so again, I could rack my brain and try to figure out what I'm being tested on. Is it on the word is? Is 227 weird? I don't usually number lakes. What's going on there? But what I'm going to do is categorize the question based on the choices available here. So number 1 is no change, i.e. this is perfect. I don't need to touch it. 1 has a period and a space starting a new sentence. one has another period and a space starting a new sentence, and one has a comma, but it takes out the words "this is" and just has comma space 1. Okay, so what I'm probably being tested on here is punctuation for 1, because it's periods versus commas, and also whether I know when a sentence is complete. This is all about combining and dividing sentences. And if I know how commas work, I know that we can't have what's called an independent clause before a comma and an independent clause after a comma as well. This sentence doesn't end till here. So an independent clause just means that whatever I've highlighted, that can be its own sentence altogether. So what I like to do on test day, what you can do is if you just put your thumb over this comma, if you just cover it up and ask yourself, okay, is everything on this side of the comma its own sentence? And is everything on the other side of the comma its own sentence? And if the answer is yes, then we either have to change the comma or we have to change the words. So in the winter of 1968, scientists David Schindler and Greg Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into Lake 227. Oh, that kind of stands on its own. This is one of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area. Yeah, that is also its own sentence. We have a subject, this, we have a verb, is, and we have the direct object, one of the bodies. So we know a comma cannot support the weight of 2 complete thoughts on either side, right? So we either have to change the thoughts so that they're dependent, so that they could no longer stand on their own as its own sentence, or we have to change the comma to something else. Now, what I can do is really, at this point, just plug and play. I can take each of these and see how it works. We already know that no change is not the answer, because we have a comma supporting 2 independent clauses. Let's plug it in here. In the winter of 1968, scientists David Schindler and Greg Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into Lake 227, period, which is one of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area. Whew, it's a mouthful. We're not going to read that whole thing every time, and I don't recommend you read this out loud either. This is going to take a lot longer for me doing it and explaining my process than it will for you on test day. On test day, you already would have been on question 15 by now. This is one of the 58, so which is one of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area? Well, it solves the problem in one way by putting a period there and ending the complete sentence, but which is one makes this a dependent clause, which means there should actually be a comma there. Which is one of the 58 freshwater bodies? That's not its own thought. So B doesn't work. It changed the wrong thing. 227, Lake 227, period. Okay, complete sentence all the way up to the period. Now, how about after the period? One of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area. Well, that's not its own sentence either. That can't stand on its own. We needed that comma there if we were going to change this is one to one. Then that really only leaves us with D. Now let's read it all together to see if it makes sense. In the winter of 1968, scientists David Schindler and Craig Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into Lake 227, comma, one of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area. Yeah, that's perfect. in that case, we have an independent clause on one side, something that could be its own sentence, but a dependent clause on the other side, something that relies on the clause before it in order to make sense. So, and then we just keep reading. We just keep reading as we go. Schindler and Brunskill were contaminating the water, not out of malice, but in the name of research. By the way, do not be intimidated by names as you encounter them. If Schindler and Brunskill kind of like twist your tongue up saying them out loud, you have nothing to worry about. You're not going to have to read it out loud on test day. Now, if I were teaching a literature class, I would encourage you to know the names of the characters and of the people you're reading and writing about and be able to pronounce them. But that's not what we're doing. All we're trying to do is get through this test and spot the mistakes as they come. So if Schindler and Brunskill are not the most natural names for you to read, just call them SMB as you go. Schindler and Brunskill were contaminating the water not out of malice, but in the name of research. While deliberately adding chemical compounds to a lake may seem destructive and irresponsible, this method of experimenting is sometimes the most effective way to influence policy and save the environment from even more damaging pollution. Okay, so now we look at the options on the right to see what I'm being tested on. And I see a couple of options. Destructive, and irresponsible this method. Destructive and, irresponsible, this method. Destructive and irresponsible this method, Okay, well, I really don't have to guess very long at what I'm being tested at. They're not changing the words at all. They're just moving the commas around. So I need to know about proper comma placement and comma use. Now, if we do that trick, again, remembering what goes on one side of the comma and what goes on the other. A comma can never support two complete thoughts on either side. So let's look at the first half. While deliberately adding chemical compounds to a lake may seem destructive and irresponsible. Well, that's not its own sentence. So that's a dependent clause. Now let's look at the second half. This method of experimenting is sometimes the most effective way to influence policy and save the environment from even more damaging pollution. That is a complete sentence. So if we were to sort of like diagram that, erasing these notes from earlier, if we were to diagram that, we have a dependent clause also known as an incomplete thought on one side of the comma, and an independent clause or a complete thought on the other side. And that's a-okay. What we can never have, again, is independent clause, comma, independent clause. That simply won't do. And we can go over the different ways to separate independent clauses, but one way would be with a period if you want to separate two full ideas. So let's look again at this. We have a dependent clause on one side and an independent on the other. I don't really see any reason to change this. So right away, we know the answer is A, no change. So now we can continue just moving through. See what they were polluting that lake. Towards what ends were they doing that? Okay, Schindler and Brunskill were investigating possible causes for the large blooms of blue-green algae, or cyanobacteria. Again, if you can't pronounce it, you don't have to pronounce it. Blue-green algae, or cyanobacteria, that had been affecting bodies of water, such as Lake Erie. In addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion, period. Oxygen depletion kills fish and other wildlife in the lakes. So those are two completely grammatically correct sentences. I don't see anything wrong with that would get you points taken off in an essay. But as we look at the question itself, it says which choice most effectively combines the underlined sentence. So what we're being asked about here is how to make writing more efficient. I know that a lot of times when we write for school, we want to kind of up our word count, right? We want to use more words and just keep writing until we hit that word count. Well, unfortunately, that's not actually good writing. Good writing is as short as possible. And whenever we can, we want to say the most things with the fewest words. We want to be concise, is the word that's used for that. So we're talking about combinations, and we're talking about which of these says the most with the fewest words. Which of these is clear, but also concise? So option A says, oh, and by the way, no change is not an option here. We gotta combine them. It's not up to us. In addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion, the result being that it kills fish and other wildlife in the lakes. Well, the thing that kind of tips my hat to that not being a great choice is that questionable use of a colon. That's not usually what we use it for. We use it to expand on an idea. Also, this phrase, the result being that it kills fish. You could just say resulting in the death of fish. The result being is an incredibly clunky, awkward kind of phrase. So I don't hate it, but I'm hoping that I'll find something better along the way. Option B, in addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion, The algal blooms cause oxygen depletion that kills fish and other wildlife in the lakes. Well, here's why I don't like this one. If we're trying to be as concise as possible, do you think that we would repeat any of our phrases? No, good writing doesn't say what it has to say more times than it has to. You say it just as much as you need to, and then you get out of there. And what I see in option B is the phrase, algal blooms cause oxygen depletion, repeated twice. And there's no need for that. So I don't like B. If you're gonna combine a sentence, why repeat words? In addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion, and oxygen depletion caused by the algal blooms kills fish and other wildlife in the lakes. This is just guilty of the same exact crime as option B, only they at least shuffled it around a little bit. Algal blooms cause oxygen depletion on one side of the comma, and oxygen depletion caused by algal blooms on the other side. Doesn't speak to a very clear or concise passage. In addition to being unsightly and odorous, These algal blooms cause oxygen depletion. You're probably sick of that phrase by now. These algal blooms cause oxygen depletion, comma, which kills fish and other wildlife in the lakes. Okay, that's great. There's no repeated phrases. There's no awkward phrases like the result being that, and there's no questionable use of punctuation. Also, if you notice, it's the shortest option. Hopefully, it will never come to you having to guess on one of these questions. But if you have to guess, the shortest in editing questions, if you're stuck between two, go with the shorter one. All right. So by now, we all know what these algal blooms cause, right? They cause oxygen depletion, in case you weren't paying attention. Just weeks after the scientists added the nitrates and phosphates, the water in Lake 227 turned bright green, period. It was thick with, colon, the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. Okay, well, even though we're seeing algal blooms for the umpteenth time, we're not allowed to change it. We're only allowed to change what's underlined in question 4. So let's look at what's listed there. One option is no change. One option is green, colon, it was thick with. One option is green, period, it was thick with dash. One option is green, comma, it was thick with. So let's look at what might be problematic about this passage. Just weeks after the scientists added the nitrates and phosphates, the water in Lake 227 turned bright green, period. It was thick with, colon, the same type of algal blooms. I'll just say that there's really no reason for a colon here. If you can just remove it and it would still mean the same. It was thick with the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. And a good rule for punctuation is never use it just for flavor. When in doubt, don't sprinkle them in there unless you can think of a specific reason to use it. So I don't like A, no change. B, green, colon, it was thick with the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. That one's our most promising one so far. Colons are almost always awkward no matter where you put them, but it is doing what a colon should do. And in case you don't know, what a colon always does is it introduces an expansion of the idea that comes before it. So if we were to plug that in, it would say, just weeks after the scientists added the nitrates and phosphates, the water in Lake 227 turned bright green, colon, it was thick with the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. So I like that one. There's a colon after green, and then it expands on the idea that it was green. Let's see if we don't have anything better though. Green, period, it was thick with dash, the same type of algal blooms that had plagued with Lake Erie. Well, this guy is just doing the same mistake as this colon up here. The sentence would read the same without it. We could just say it was thick with the same type of algal blooms. We don't need that dash. So I don't like C. D says, when plugged in, just weeks after the scientists added the nitrates and phosphates, the water in Lake 227 turned bright green, comma, it was thick with the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. Well, that creates a problem for our comma rule, because at that point, we have a complete thought on one side of the comma and a complete thought on the other side of the comma. And we just learned that we're not allowed to do that. If you have an independent clause over here, a comma alone cannot support the weight of an independent clause or complete thought on the other side. So for that reason, D is out for me. B is the one that I will have to go with. So hopefully you're seeing my rhythm as I work through these questions. We just keep reading and we stop as we go and we plug and play until we find what suits our knowledge of grammar and also just suits our ears as English speakers and English readers and writers. We know what sounds good and we know what sounds weird. One mission of the experimental lakes area is to conduct research that helps people better understand threats to the environment. So now we're moving on to a new paragraph, and we have a whole sentence that's underlined. And we're being asked, which choice provides the best transition from the previous paragraph to this one? Now, 5 is a bit of a tricky question. I would actually recommend coming back to it because this is asking, how do we provide the connective tissue, right? Sort of those threads between the main idea of one paragraph and the main idea of the next. The issue with that is I don't know what the main idea of this paragraph is yet, so I don't actually know what type of transition we need. So let's just come back to 5. But I would recommend if you ever need to come back to something in writing and language, circle it. I'm highlighting it here, but circle it on your test. The tests are yours. You can mark them up however it best suits you. So let's see what that main idea is, and then let's come back to 5. I'm just going to highlight that whole question so I don't forget. The scientist divided the lake in half by placing a nylon barrier through the narrowest part of its figure 8 shape. In one half of Lake 226, they added phosphates, nitrates, and a source of carbon. In the other, they added just nitrates, and a source of carbon was added. Okay, so that should already sound a little weird to you if you're following along, but let's look at what we're being tested at. Okay, either no change or and a source of carbon, plus also a source of carbon, but also adding a source of carbon. I think we're being tested on which one is most concise. Once again, those are another way to categorize the questions, and I would recommend you write this down. This is also some helpful information. On the writing and language section, you're going to be tested by one of the, usually anyway, by one of the 3 C's. Let's see if I can get this. Okay, you're going to be tested on the 3 C's. You want to make sure that everything you're reading is clear. That means, does it make sense based on what I know of grammar and just how language works? Is it consistent? That means, does the tone, does how this passage feel match the rest of what I'm seeing with the passage? Or does that feel like it came out of nowhere? Clear, consistent, and concise. So those are the 3 C's we're being tested on. And I think it'll be pretty straightforward which one we're being tested on in number 6. And a source of carbon, plus also a source of carbon, but also adding a source of carbon. We're being tested on whether or not this is the most concise. None of these are actually grammatically incorrect, but they're all pretty awkward. So in terms of concision, which one says the same thing with the fewest words? It's option B. And a source of carbon gets us there. We don't need to say, and a source of carbon was added, because we already have added up here. We know that we're adding things. We don't need to say plus also, because those two words just mean the same thing. And we don't need to say but also adding, because that, again, just repeats added, and but also is an awkward way to bring up a new idea. So B is what we're going to go with there. All right, I haven't forgotten about you, question number 5. I'm coming back as soon as I have a better idea of the main idea of this paragraph. Schindler and Brunskill hypothesized that phosphates were responsible for the growth of cyanobacteria. The experiment confirmed their suspicions when the half of the lake containing the phosphates was teeming with blue-green algae. So what are we being tested on? Question number 7, our options are either no change, were teeming, are teeming, and teems. So if you don't know what teeming is, that just means it's being filled to the brim. So if my cup of coffee is just teeming with hot coffee, that means it's all the way up. Usually implies that it's also growing. Like if your sink were teeming, you better be careful, it's about to overflow. But what we're being tested on here is whether there's subject-verb agreement, whether was teeming is correct, or should we be saying were or are, or should we just be saying teams? What we have to do here is go back to our subject. That makes sense, right? Subject, verb, agreement. What does this verb actually refer to? What was teeming? It's not the phosphates weren't teeming, but it was the half of the lake containing the phosphates was teeming. So, does it make sense to say half of the lake was teeming? And it does, actually. We don't need to change anything. Half of the lake were teeming doesn't make any sense. Half of the lake are teeming, and half of the lake teems would make sense if we were writing in the present tense. But you see, we're writing in the past consistently, confirmed, and were responsible. All of this happened in the past. So hopefully that lake isn't still currently teeming with blue-green algae. I hope that Schindler and Brunskill got out of there. But it was teeming at the time. That's a subject-verb agreement question. Moving on to question 8. Oh, looks like, oh my goodness. You know what I just did? I almost forgot about question 5. Question 5, you wanted to see me fall. It's not going to happen. Which choice provides the best transition from the previous paragraph to this one? Well, we know that this one is basically about them testing a theory that as to what was causing the algae. Their theory was that phosphates were causing the growth of cyanobacteria, right? So it goes into their actions based on that theory. Now let's see what the previous paragraph was about. We can remember, Schindler and Brunskill were investigating possible causes. Okay, yes, and algal blooms cause oxygen depletion. My goodness, we'll remember that until we die. That's just drilled into our brains. Just weeks after the scientists added the nitrates and phosphates, it was thick with algal blooms. Okay, so this is how the last one ends. And this is how the next one begins. It should provide that connection. By the way, splitting up paragraphs like this and splitting up context questions like this among different pages and different columns is something that unfortunately the SAT does all the time. They do it to eat up your time. They do it so that you'll spend so much time flipping back and forth that you'll run out of time before you get to answer all the questions. But you're smart and you're going to have these strategies in hand, so you'll have plenty of time to do what we're doing tonight. So which provides the best transition from those algal blooms to this one, to their action? The scientists divided the lake in half by placing a nylon barrier in a figure-8 shape. Well, what we have right now is one mission of the experimental lakes area is to conduct research that helps people better understand threats to the environment. That doesn't connect at all to nylon barriers or figure-8 shapes, so I don't like A. The experimental lakes area is located in a sparsely inhabited region that experiences few effects of human and industrial activity. Again, this doesn't have anything to do with human or industrial activity. This has to do with the scientists' activity. So I guess technically that's human activity. But the rest of this doesn't even talk about how isolated it is. So I don't like B either. To isolate the cause of the algae, Schindler and Brunskill performed another experiment, this time using Lake 226. Okay, so this one I like. We're about to learn what they did, and we've switched lakes, which I don't know if you guys caught that. Well, we are talking about Lake 226 in this paragraph, whereas in the previous one, it was all about 227. So let's see if we find something better than C, but I like C so far. The process by which water becomes enriched by dissolved nutrients such as phosphates is called eutrophication. Eutrophication. No, that has nothing to do with any of it. That has nothing to do with these nylon barriers. These nylon barriers are all about the experiment taking place. So C is clearly our best answer. Get out of here, eutrophication. You're just there to make us waste time trying to pronounce you. All right, we're finally almost at the end of this algal blooms research passage. Schindler and Brunskill's findings were shown off by the journal Science. Okay, what are we being tested on here? Shown off by. No change, put in the spotlight of, published in, or put into. Well, let's look at our 3 C's. Is it clear? Yeah, I know what you mean by shown off by. Is it consistent? Well, that's a question of tone. And shown off by, that seems a little informal to me. That seems a little bit like something I would say to my friends, like these scientists were really showing it off. But it seems like there might be a more formal way to say that. And it looks like that's what we're being tested on here. None of these words are grammatically incorrect, and none of these words really mean something different, and there's no change in punctuation. We're just being tested on tone. How does the passage feel? And does the passage feel differently if we put these phrases in? So shown off by, again, it's a little informal. It's a little too casual for my taste. Schindler and Brunskill's findings were put in the spotlight of the journal Science. That's just as showy. That's and honestly a weird way to describe scientific journals. I don't think you could ever ask if a scientist was in the spotlight. Most research scientists are pretty obscure. I mean, I've never heard of these guys before. Schindler and Brunskill's findings were published in the journal Science. I like that best so far. Findings were put into the journal Science. Well, tone-wise, it's better than A and B, but it's not very clear. Put into is just a much more physical word. Like they could have just grabbed a copy of the journal Science, grabbed their findings, and physically placed it in between the pages. Now that's kind of silly, but it's those types of clarity questions. We want to maximize the clarity of what we're being asked. So for that reason, I like C the best. The research demonstrated a clear correlation between introducing phosphates and the growth of blue-green algae. For example, legislators in Canada passed laws banning phosphates in laundry detergents, which had been entering the water supply. So what are we being tested on? Let's look at the options. We have similarly, however, and subsequently. Okay, now I know we're being tested on what these are called, which is transitional phrases. Phrases that bring you from one thought to the next. Now we'll be able to go into those in some more detail later. But if we have something that says, for example, that means that what follows should be an example of what came before. So if the research demonstrated this, the clear correlation between phosphates and blue-green algae, then this should be about blue-green algae. But this is about legislators in Canada passing laws banning phosphates in laundry detergents. So I don't really like A. Similarly, legislators in Canada passed laws. Well, that's a connection that implies that two things were sort of doing the same thing. And this is all about correlations between phosphates and algae. And what comes next is all about passing different laws on laundry soap. So I don't think that's similarly, though it is closer than for example. However, is what we would call a contradictor of transitional phrases. However means I've said one thing, but I'm about to say something to the contrary. I'm about to say something that comes pretty close to being the opposite. And for this reason, I don't like C, because these laws make sense with this finding. If these phosphates were causing this algae in the water supply, it makes sense that the legislators would try and ban that phosphate from getting into the water and causing algae. So it's not really a contradictor. Subsequently. Now, that's a $10 word. It's also our only option. Subsequently just means because of this. Or really it just means next in the sequence, subsequence. So after this, legislators in Canada passed laws banning phosphates. That makes the most sense to me. All right, and then at the end here, we have number 10 seemingly not linked to anything. So let's see. Oh, this is more of an editor question. All right. At this point, the writer wants to add a second policy outcome of the research described. Which choice best accomplishes? Okay, what is the goal? We want to hear another policy outcome related to the research, meaning that what these lawmakers did with laundry soap, that's one result of the research. But the writer wants to add one more thing. This is your friend about to turn in this essay to class. They're like, I feel like it's just missing one more example. So let's find another policy outcome. Which choice best accomplishes this goal? A, Lake 226 continued to develop blooms of blue-green algae for 8 consecutive years after the experiment took place. Well, no, that's not a policy. That's just a lake growing algae. So I don't like A. B, in the United States, many individual states have also adopted legislation to eliminate or at least reduce phosphorus content in laundry detergents. I like B so far. Talking about policy outcomes. C, in 1974, Schindler initiated a study of the effects of acid rain using Lake 223 to examine how sulfuric acid altered aquatic ecosystems. Okay, that isn't connected to policy outcomes, and it's not connected to the research we've been reading about. It actually just describes a whole different brand of research. So C, get out of here. D, aerial photos of the lakes taken before and during algal blooms helped convey the effects of phosphates in water to the public. Now that is a contender. You could almost make an argument for D because it is connected to how people's lives were affected. But what we want to find is a connection in policy, and a connection of laws and rules that were adopted because of this research. So because of that, B is our best answer. Okay, take a deep breath. We just worked through our first writing and language passage together. So just kind of take an assessment. How did that feel? Did that feel like I was sort of babying you through it and you kind of knew everything already? Did you feel like you wanted more explained? Hopefully that provided basically a kind of just a kind of litmus test for how these tests generally operate. Now we're going to go on to the next passage, so keep paying attention, keep writing down anything that doesn't make sense to you, but we're going to look at the next one and see how these same patterns, these same basic skills, they're going to carry through to every writing and language passage you encounter. So let's keep on scrolling. So now we're on page 26 of your PDF. And what do you know? It looks like I jumped the gun. It looks like we got one more question left on these phosphates. All right, let's knock it out of the park. I think we can do it. Experiments like these can help people understand the unintended consequences of using certain household products. Of course, regulating the use of certain chemical compounds can be a controversial issue. Now let's see here. Which choice most effectively anticipates and addresses a relevant counter-argument to the argument in favor of the types of experiments described in this passage? So we're looking for a choice. That sentence kind of went all over the place, but we're looking for something that will sort of look ahead at an objection someone might have to what you're saying, to what this passage is saying, and kind of try and nip those counter arguments in the bud, or at least address them. You've all probably been in conversations like this, right? Where you feel like you're going to have to defend yourself, or you're going to have to make an argument, and you're afraid someone's going to misunderstand you. So a lot of times what strong writers will do is they'll head off those misunderstandings at the pass, and they'll say, no, I understand you might be concerned about this, but this isn't what I'm saying, or what I'm saying is different from what you're thinking about. So let's see which of these actually taps into that kind of thinking, into that kind of counter argument. Of course, regulating the use of certain chemical compounds can be a controversial issue. So that does get at some opposition. So I would mark A for now, but it doesn't actually get into what people might have against it. It just addresses the fact that people might be against it. But let's mark A for now. It's our best so far. It's the only one we've looked at. Many companies now offer phosphate-free alternatives for household cleaning products. Well, that doesn't really get at an argument against these kinds of experiments. That's just talking about how companies are adapting their products on top of this research. So I don't really like B. Doesn't offer an argument at all. C, obviously, scientists should not be allowed to randomly perform experiments on just any body of water. Okay, so that one does actually get ahead of a potential counter argument. That one says, hey, you might be reading this and be concerned. Can any scientist just dump stuff into whatever lake they want and see what happens? This one's getting ahead. It's anticipating a counter argument and addressing it. So I like C better than A. Let's cross out A because C is our best choice so far. Option D, phosphates are sometimes used in agricultural fertilizers in addition to being used in cleaning products. Well, that's just more about product integration. Again, that's not really about arguments, that's just about where phosphates are. So C is our best option there. And now we're through with the phosphate passage. Let's look at something a little more artsy. Still has to do with some sciences, but isn't so focused on biology as the last one. That, by the way, is about the length of all of these passages. You're going to have about 11 questions on each passage. And if you do the math, you have 44 total questions, 11 questions a passage. That means you'll be doing about 4 of these passages. Doing them with me online, out loud, explaining everything, of course it's going to take so much longer. But you're going to be doing them on your own. You're not going to have to explain your work to anybody. You're internalizing these strategies that I'm taking the time to explain now. And so you're going to zip through these much quicker than I am now, and much quicker than you would be if you had gone into this without any of these strategies. So let's look a little bit at the Tower of Pisa. We probably won't be able to get all the way through, but who knows? So this one's called A Little to the Left, but Not Too Much. A title doesn't tell us much. Sometimes these titles are just distracting. Italy's Tower of Pisa has been leaning southward since the initial stages of its construction over 800 years ago. So stages of its is what might be in question. We have A, no change, B, stages of its, with like stage apostrophe S of its, S apostrophe. C is stages of its, stage apostrophe S, it apostrophe S, or stages of its, no apostrophes anywhere. Well, what are we being tested on? Shouldn't be too hard to figure it out. We're being tested on punctuation, specifically on apostrophes. Now, if you know your apostrophe rules, you'll know that for a word like stages, an apostrophe could either be possessive, Like if we were talking about, let's say we were talking about like a stage you were performing on, and we said the stage's floorboards are cracking. Okay, so that would be the floorboards belonging to the stage. That's possessive. Or it can be a contraction. Stages could be split into stage and is. So that's how it works normally. Now with its is a very particular case. With its, you only use an apostrophe when you can say it is. If you can't say it is, then you need to be using just ITS as used in option D. So that narrows things down quite a bit for us, because there's only one of these that doesn't use an apostrophe at all. So initial stages of its construction over 800 years ago. It is construction. That doesn't make any sense. So D immediately is our only option. Boom, on to the next one. We're on fire. Indeed, comma, if the tower's construction had not taken 2 centuries and involved significant breaks due to war and civil unrest, which allowed the ground beneath the tower to settle, the tower would likely have collapsed before it was completed. So our choices for 13 include no change, the word indeed, the word therefore, nevertheless, and however. Do these look familiar? This is another question about transitional phrases. It's about whether the word being underlined continues an idea, contradicts an idea, or adds on to the idea in some significant way. So on one side of the transition, we have Italy's Tower of Pisa has been leaning southward for over 800 years, apparently. And then we have, indeed, if the tower's construction had not taken 2 centuries and involved significant breaks, which allowed the ground beneath the tower to settle, the tower would likely have collapsed before it was completed. So on one side, we say the tower's been tilting for a long time. And on the other side, we say if it hadn't taken so long to build, it probably would have fallen over. Those two ideas don't seem in contradiction to me, so I don't like however, because however is all about introducing something contrary to what has been said before. Nevertheless is another sort of contradictor. And if I have 2 options that mean the exact same thing on these transitional phrases, guess what? They're both wrong. Therefore would mean that this had caused, that what had come before the transition caused what comes after it. Now, you might be tempted to say that it's been leaning southward since the initial stages of its construction, and therefore, if this had not happened, it would have fallen. But the link isn't so strong. Not everything that leans south is about to fall over, right? I know that may seem like a silly question, but that's the type of link we're talking about. I like indeed because it continues the idea without saying that A causes B. So for that reason, I'm going to go with A, no change. All right, let's find out some more about this tower here. Luckily, the tower survived, and its tilt has made it an Italian icon, comma. It attracts visitors from all over who flock to Pisa to see one of the greatest architectural weirdnesses in the world. All right, so remember this strategy for commas, which is what we're being tested on. I don't even have to go through them. I just know from a quick glance, I'm being tested on comma and semicolon use. That's the one thing that all these have in common. So if I cover up the comma, Is what comes before it a complete sentence? And is what comes after it a complete sentence? Because if so, then there shouldn't be a comma there. If so, we need to change something. We need to either change the punctuation or we need to change the words. So before up to the comma, luckily the tower survived and its tilt has made it an Italian icon. I like it. That's a complete sentence. That stands on its own. That is an independent clause. Independent, doesn't need us, doesn't need the rest of this, rather. Other side of the comma, it attracts visitors from all over who flock to Pisa to see one of the greatest architectural weirdnesses in the world. Well, weirdnesses is a weird word, but it looks like we'll be tested on that later. Aside from that, yeah, everything's in order. This could also stand on its own. But a comma can't support two independent clauses, two complete thoughts on either side. So for that reason, I don't really like A, no change. We either got to change that punctuation or we have to change the words. So let's plug and play. Has made it an Italian icon, comma, attracting visitors from all over. I like that quite a bit. That makes this a dependent clause. That makes this no longer a complete sentence. Attracting visitors from all over who flock to Pisa is not its own thought. Icon, comma, so let's mark B and see if we come up to anything better. Icon, comma, it's attracting visitors from all over. No, that doesn't make sense. If we're trying to say it is attracting, there should be an apostrophe here. And if we're doing that, then there can't be a comma supporting it because it's a complete sentence. So I don't like C. Then looking at D, icon, semicolon, attracting visitors from all over. Now, the semicolon, we can go into in some depth later. Really what you need to know for now is that the semicolon is like the period's pretentious cousin. Okay, the semicolon does the exact same job as a period. It holds up one sentence on one side and another complete thought on the other side. So if I have a semicolon, then what follows and what precedes it should be a complete sentence. Here's the issue. We already know from option B that attracting visitors from all over who flock to Pisa is not a complete sentence. So that semicolon is brought in to do a job that it was never designed to do. So for that reason, I like B the best. Let's see where we go from here. So we've decided on icon, comma, attracting visitors from all over who flock to Pisa to see one of the greatest architectural weirdnesses in the world. So our choices for 15 are deviations, oddities, and abnormalities. So all of these kind of mean the same thing, right? They mean something that's strange, something that's not normal. So we're not being asked about whether the word is strictly correct. We're being asked about tone. How does the passage feel? Now you guys probably already noticed weirdness is a strange word. It's a weird word. You shouldn't be using it in writing a formal passage. You really shouldn't be using it in, one of your own essays for school. So weirdnesses doesn't fit that sort of medium formal tone we're looking for. Deviations is all right, one of the greatest architectural deviations in the world. What's difficult there is that if something deviates, it means it's moving away from what is normal. And that word sounds a little funny when we haven't even talked about what is normal in the first place. Does that make sense? If we haven't talked about the standard, we can't really talk about deviations from the standard. Something always has to deviate from something. And we never see any reference to what PISA might be deviating from in this sentence. So I don't really like B. Oddities is also good. Yeah, I like oddities. There's really no detractors there. It's odd, it's strange, and it's a much less awkward word than weirdness is. So let's mark C for now. Abnormalities is tempting. And I'm going to guess it's probably tempting for you guys because it's the longest word and it sounds the smartest. And maybe I'm wrong, but that's what would tempt me about this word. Abnormalities is usually used in a medical sense. If you're having medical abnormality, again, that's something that deviates from the norm. And like with option B, we haven't talked about what's normal. Talking about what's abnormal is a little odd. And it's also just a very negative way to phrase this. And abnormality seems like a problem. It seems like a condition. When in reality, it's strange, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong. So for that reason, I like C. All right, I think we can do one more question. So 16, with nothing underlined next to it. Bum, bum, bum. Probably we're going to insert something that wasn't there before. And what do we got? Lo and behold. At this point, the writer is considering adding the footnotes. Unfortunately, the tower's tilt has steadily increased over the centuries, placing the structure in danger of collapse. Now, in good writing, every sentence should have hooks in the sentence before it and in the sentence after it. You need to see if this sentence right here, talking about the tower's tilt of collapse, links the sentences before and after in a good way. So the sentence where we would insert it in number 16. Luckily, the tower survived, and its tilt has made it an Italian icon. Visitors from all over who flock to Pisa to see one of the great architectural oddities in the world. Okay, so it's talking about its tilt. By the late 20th century, the angle of the tower's tilt had reached an astonishing 5.5 degrees. In 1990, Italy's government ordered visitors and appointed a committee to find a way to save it. Okay, so we're talking about tilt before option 16, and we're talking about danger after option 16. So I think this sentence works really well. So that immediately eliminates C and D. Right now we're 50-50 on who wants to be a millionaire. A says, yes, it's an important restatement of the main claim in the previous sentence. Okay, what was the main claim in the previous sentence? Let's look. The tilt is an icon and attracts visitors. Well, this sentence doesn't say anything about visitors or nature. So no, I don't like A. I think B makes the most sense with what we know already. It establishes an emphasis in the paragraph's discussion about the tower's tilt. We're no longer talking about how iconic it is. We're talking it might be in danger of collapse. And if you want to know how that ends, you'll have to do the rest of that passage on your own. That's in practice test 6 to see how they figured that out. Well, hopefully that gave an idea of how the writing and language section basically plays out. You're given options to insert or possibly to, you're being given editor questions that have to do with tone and flow and how it feels. And then you're also given proofreader questions that have to do with the right and wrong of how language should operate in its most clear, consistent, and forms. Who are looking for private tutoring, my name is Mr. Scott, and I'm available as a tutor. In fact, let me just pull that up. So if you email info@embracetutoring.com, you can let them know that you would like to receive personal tutoring from me with reading comp or writing and language strategies, help you take those test scores from good to great. All right, well, I hope this gives you an idea of how this portion of the test will operate. We'll be here at the same time next week to go over some more reading comp strategies. Handle those bulkier passages that don't just have to do with the right and wrongs of grammar, but have to do with holding on to an entire passage in your head, analyzing its particular points. All right, have a great night, guys, and I'll see you next week.